Here in America, there is a problem with our food. Americans have a massive weight problem, and it's not just the number of Americans who are fat, it's the amount of obesity per person. People have known for a while that processed food and greasy burgers aren't good for you. But American fat people have still been the laughingstock of nations around the world because other countries have processed garbage and McDonald's, and they don't have anywhere near the same level of obesity that we have. In the last few years, I kept seeing stories of Europeans visiting America, eating the same kind of food that they had back home, and rapidly gaining weight. Then they go back home, and the weight comes right off once they get back to the food of their home countries. And this was when the mockery started turning into concern, because they realized that there was something wrong with the food in the United States. We now know that American food companies have been poisoning us with chemicals that are illegal in most of the rest of the world. These include chemicals in the food designed to prevent us from feeling full, causing us to eat more of their products, and other chemicals designed to make us addicted to the processed food. In particular, I've noticed this problem with our bread. I've heard more conservative talking heads tell people that bread naturally makes us fat, and that by nature, since you cannot eat wheat that you pick straight off the plant, it's a hyper-processed food, and therefore should be avoided. But this is bread we're talking about, one of the oldest dietary staples in the human experience. Every culture on Earth has its own type of bread. How could something humanity depended upon for millennia be so unhealthy? Well, because it's full of sugar. Or at least, American bread is. If you go outside of America, you can find bread that doesn't make you gain weight because it isn't crammed full of sugars that are designed to make you addicted, in addition to the unhealthy nature of the sugar itself. I've actually been experimenting with making my own bread because it's the only way to get bread in America that doesn't contain this kind of junk. And even though I'm using the same processed flour from the supermarket because I can't find anything else right now, but once I started eating homemade bread, I had to start eating more food to avoid rapid weight loss. I have no doubt in my mind that there are going to be lawsuits in the near future, especially with the new administration's dedication to health. The federal government might actually take action against these companies. Some of these food corporations will go bankrupt, some people might go to jail, and a lot of them will lose their reputations. But the damage is already done. Americans are incredibly unhealthy, and no amount of legal action is going to fix that. The thing is, these companies would argue that their goal was to make products that people wanted to buy, and make sure that people would want more. They can, and in some cases have, argued that the chemically spiked food is what people wanted. And those chemicals they used were discovered by scientifically analyzing what people want to eat and what makes people happy when they consume them. In essence, the companies gave people what they wanted, even when it made them irreversibly unhealthy. Companies that strictly produced organic food in recent decades have suffered because why eat organic, healthy food that doesn't taste as good and is more expensive when processed food is cheap and tasty? What you put into your mouth shapes the health of your body, and what you put into your brain shapes the health of your mind. By now, you've probably figured out where I'm going with all of this. Wish fulfillment in media is to your mind what junk food is to your body. Now, wish fulfillment by itself is simply defined as a story with at least one outcome that the author would like to see happen in real life. Or, alternatively, a story with outcomes that the author thinks the audience would like to see happen in real life. With a definition that broad, it's impossible to avoid wish fulfillment without creating a story that is so bland and boring no one would want to read it. A bit of wish fulfillment is necessary, like roasting your broccoli in the oven so it doesn't taste like lawnmower clippings. There's a big difference between seasoning food and filling it with poison, and the same goes for brain food. But when people think of wish fulfillment, there's usually a handful of specific concepts that come to mind. Most commonly, a lot of wish fulfillment involves a character getting something that the audience or the author wants without having to do the necessary work to earn it. There's a difference between this kind of wish fulfillment and your bog standard escapism. You can have escapism that doesn't fill your head with unrealistic expectations. An action movie, for example, might give you an outlet for the rage that you have towards your own life. Or a mystery thriller might give your brain the intellectual stimulation that you're not getting in the real world. These are completely harmless forms of escapism. Then there's media that shows us characters achieving the things that we'd like in the real world, and their hard work pays off. Even though in real life it doesn't always work that way, we wish people who make the necessary sacrifices would be rewarded, and this kind of wish fulfillment can motivate us to keep trying in our own lives, even when reality doesn't cooperate. But then there's the other kind of wish fulfillment. The stuff that comes to mind whenever you see this image from Barnes & Noble. Now, I've heard the theory that women like this stuff because they're looking for a superhero who will protect the woman in real life, and I've also heard that women are getting more nervous about physical danger as crime rates across the first world keep escalating. However, I also have a sister who says women who like this stuff are just freaks who need therapy, so I'm not sure what to believe. But I do miss the days when women were thirsting over vampires and werewolves. At least those guys are mostly human most of the time. Now they're going gaga over a guy who's got some kind of skull for a head. And his ribs are showing. And I think some of these things are supposed to be death itself. Ask not for whom the gooner goons. She goons for thee, apparently. Let's be frank. These kinds of books are just smut. And you know how people can get addicted to adult material? Like adult videos or spicy pictures? Well, the same rules apply to spicy books. I'm not saying you can't have stuff like this in your books and media here and there, and it's a bit like having attractive video game characters. 2B and Eve are both attractive female characters, but that's an eye candy. You can't really enjoy the game by just zooming in on their fully clothed models, because the games aren't really about that. It's when the smut is front and center that it becomes a problem. Now, back when I was still going to writers' groups, I met a number of women who liked to write two kinds of wish fulfillment. The first was where an incredibly unattractive woman ends up with an over-the-top attractive guy, and the second was the fantasy of a woman leaving their current husbands and families and going off to a life of fame and success without them. In the first story, it would usually be something like a really, really fat woman who has this high-ranking businessman or CEO wrapped around her finger, and what really tips a story like that over the edge is when the fat woman can get the CEO to do whatever she wants by threatening to leave him if he doesn't comply. As if rich, billionaire CEOs with chiseled abs can't just find another morbidly obese woman who will date them. This is the fantasy of every person who wants the ultimate, most attractive person in the world to be head over heels in love with them, without the main character ever having to be an attractive person themselves. And it's pretty obvious that people who consume this stuff are ultimately doing harm to themselves, and that it encourages them not to put in the necessary work to be attractive to other people. I think that most people at this point know that the anime where the ordinary dude gets a harem of ridiculously cute girls all vying for his affections is doing more harm to its male audience than to any real women in real life. I saw plenty of guys writing stuff like that in writers' groups too. But the other type of fantasy is particularly egregious, and it harkens back to the damage done by Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. When that woman published her book about leaving her family and going on sexcapades throughout Europe, it worked because she was still relatively attractive at the age of 37. She had a career as a journalist back when that word didn't make people want to barf, and she had already published 3 books that were successful. But the biggest issue I have with Eat, Pray, Love is the fact that Gilbert received a $200,000 advance from her publisher to go on her tour of Europe after pitching the idea for the novel. She made an autobiography of her sex vacation through Europe, and she got her publisher to pay for it. So when lots of women across the English-speaking world either read the book or watched the movie and thought that they could just abandon their families and go gallivanting through Europe and still become rich and successful, all that ended up happening is a lot of families were irreparably destroyed, and the women who did this all ended up in poverty. As a general rule, I have a problem with creators who like to put forward a particular type of wish fulfillment that will never hurt the authors themselves. I understand that a lot of writers make stories like this because they're basically writing out their own personal fantasies, but those people are very rarely the ones that ever actually sell lots of copies. The people who make bank off of this kind of trash are often the ones who aren't getting high off of their own supply, because unlike someone who's writing their romantasy novel one-handed, the successful authors have to generalize the fantasy enough that it isn't necessarily tailored to their own personal tastes. Some of these authors actually advertise, and you should really look this up if you can. They advertise the different tropes in their novels as if being tropey were a selling point. I know that tropes are not necessarily cliches, and that tropes are tools, but there is something lost when a book or other work of media is literally just assembled from tropes with no overarching story behind it. Generally speaking, high art is meant to be thought-provoking, and doesn't pander to its audience. The goal of high art is to make you learn new things about the world around you, and maybe yourself as well. Low art is, well, the opposite. It doesn't challenge you or make you think about anything in a new way. A lot of times, it doesn't make you think at all. For example, most of the Michael Bay Transformers movies are low art. They aren't supposed to make you think, they're supposed to entertain you as robots who transform into cars beat the crap out of each other and try to sell you toys. This doesn't make these movies bad. Okay, some of them are. Okay, a lot of them are. But then you have Transformers 1. This movie, which is better than anything with Michael Bay's name on it has any right to be, is high art. I don't want to spoil it, but this film manages to do the impossible. Explain how Optimus Prime and Megatron could go from being best friends to enemies for a war that goes on forever. Now, in general, wish fulfillment by default leans more towards low art, and it's a bit like a seasoning that you're adding to a meal. You can have a little wish fulfillment and still make a higher work of art, but if you just dump the stuff in, it's no longer going to be thought-provoking. A lot of this wish fulfillment, especially in the YA genre, is basically just slop. And the arguments people who make and defend this slop are usually something like, well, at least people are reading. Let them enjoy the things they like. Or, more recently, authors of these books will claim that it's hard to stand out these days among all the self-published and AI slop out there, and that it is necessary as a matter of capitalism to sell people the product that they want to buy, even if it is bad for the consumers in the long run. The problem I have with this argument is that it's the same argument a food company selling processed garbage would make to justify feeding consumers toxic waste as long as people are willing to buy it. People are absolutely responsible for what they choose to consume. No question. If you choose to smoke cigarettes until your lungs turn into charcoal, you are absolutely responsible for that decision. And if you sell people cigarettes knowing what they do to people, you're responsible for that too. And the authors who make this kind of trash when they know it's bad for people who consume it are the same. But there's one more element I need to point out. I've mentioned the word slop a few times in this video, but I want to clarify. Slop is not always bad. It's not even necessarily bad for you. In this video, you can see a team of people in India making a massive amount of sweet rice for as many people as possible in a giant cauldron. Due to the nature of what they're trying to do, they have to dump the ingredients into the cauldron in a rather callous manner. There's no room for any level of artisanal pampering of the food, because they just can't make 5 metric tons of sweet rice in a reasonable amount of time otherwise. Then the rice is literally scooped out of the cauldron in buckets by a man wearing special shoe covers that are kept clean before he enters the cauldron. The buckets are poured into large steel barrels, which are also clean, and are served to as many pilgrims in the area as possible. This food is undeniably slop, by every definition of the word. But it is still made by well-meaning people who are simply trying to feed as many people as possible. It cannot be tailored to any individual who will consume it. It has to be made for broad, mass consumption. The rice contains no meat or animal products because many of the people who will be eating it will be Hindu pilgrims. But the people who consume it report that it is delicious, and as best as we can tell, the food is rich in nutritional value. Things can be made for a large consumer base as inoffensively as possible and still be good, both in terms of its appeal and by being beneficial for the consumer. The people who are making garbage food that's designed to poison consumers and get them addicted are not simply adhering to the rules of capitalism. Sneaking chemicals into their products that the consumers don't know are there and likely wouldn't buy if they did is fraud. And if they only continue buying the stuff after you get them addicted, that doesn't make it okay either. And as I mentioned before, I can't buy bread that doesn't contain sugar, which means the product that I would like to purchase isn't available. In a purely capitalistic society, there should be plenty of companies willing to sell unmodified products to people who want to buy them. And similarly, the books that new authors make now do not have to be packed with toxic wish fulfillment. I mentioned Transformers 1 earlier, and said it was high art. This movie is completely appropriate for children, and contains nothing that would have gotten it banned from China or any other countries. There's nothing offensive about it, and it's also part of a popular multimedia franchise. Like the Indian sweet rice earlier, this movie is slop, made to be mass-produced, easy to consume, and sell toys. But it is slop made with care. And for wish fulfillment that fits the romance angle, the solution is really simple. Stop partnering characters with massive differences in attractiveness. Give your protagonist something that stands out to the other person so that they have a reason to want to date them. I'm not gonna lie, some relationship mismatches are never going to work out. I've learned from living with fat people in the past that the reality of how different their lifestyles are from people who work out and watch what they eat is going to drive a wedge between groups of people who aren't romantically involved. And that's when they don't have to worry about keeping the chemistry going. But a clever writer can still make good content for a large audience without relying on elements that are ultimately harmful to that audience. Of course, the active word in that sentence is clever, and if you're struggling in that department, you might want to hit that like and subscribe button to get more helpful videos like this one. And you can read my books over on Amazon, which are a great example of a fantasy series that don't feed you toxic wish fulfillment, if I do say so myself. I'm still looking for a way to make them into audiobooks, and I just don't have a good voice for it, so if anyone listening is looking for a job in vocal work, give me a message in the comments below. I've also gotten a number of readers tell me that Janan could use an RPG game, which I have no idea how to make, so I'm listening if people have ideas for that too. And finally, today's featured game is called The King is Watching. It's a bit of an odd strategy game in that I'm not actually sure what to compare it to. It's not quite a tower defense game, and it's not a typical strategy game. The idea is that you're protecting your little city from waves of monsters, and you need to produce food, resources, and troops from the buildings you're able to make in your area. The only caveat is that these buildings only produce things while you, the king, are watching them. There's probably a joke in here about how boomers think managing an office is supposed to work, but all in all, I wasn't impressed. Maybe if the game had more story, it would be better. It is worth noting that the full game hasn't been released on Steam yet. So far, all that's available is the demo. I might give this one an update if the full version turns out to be better. Alright, that's all I have for today. Thank you all, and goodbye.